Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest news from the front line in the war in Ukraine. And starting out we have an update, and this is a few days old, but it was reported by both Ukrainian news sources but also by Kremlin that Russian deep reconnaissance groups have started attacking on the border between Russia and Chernihiv, as well as Belarus and Chernihiv. So I'm not exactly sure where on this border it is, but there has been reports that this happening by the city itself, so somewhere in the northwestern parts of the Chernihiv region. This is actually very interesting because it shows that the Wagner forces, according to Kremlin, have started doing some operations here in the northern parts next to Chernihiv, which could indicate a future operations in this area. And it could also be a distraction, as we have seen reports earlier a few weeks ago, once that it was announced that Wagner would be sent to Belarus, that Ukraine would start reinforcing their northern border, which would allow them to protect the northern border in case of Wagner relocating to Belarus and attacking from there. So essentially we are seeing the Ukrainians sending some reserves from the southern parts of the front line to the northern parts to ensure the security of the northern parts. So this means that they are splitting up the Ukrainian forces, which are currently concentrated in the south. Then we have these two intelligence updates, the first from the UK Ministry of Defence, the second from the Institute for the Study of War. First, the UK Ministry of Defence, they mentioned 3 points, and these are all in accordance to the Wagner uprising. So this is in relation to what we're seeing right now. So essentially what they're saying is that there was a 3-pronged step coverage of the Wagner uprising by Russian state media. The first one being that the Russian state media kept the coverage of the events to a very small limit, as they didn't want to say something wrong. Then the second step was that they announced this as a victory, that their uprising stopped and that there was essentially no bloodshed. And then finally the fact that Prigozhin is now quote-unquote a criminal. That is the third phase. So essentially staying away from trouble, then reporting that Putin has won this uprising, and then stating that Prigozhin is a bad person. So this is very interesting because it does indeed quote-unquote follow these steps with how the Russian state has checked Prigozhin's private property. He's now exiled to Belarus and so on. However, this is just to frame it in a situation where the Ukrainian forces, where they frame this whole situation to be a disaster for Prigozhin, and that he's essentially thrown aside. He's the one who is the criminal, and he's not going to be holding any position in the future. We don't know any of that yet. So this is purely speculation on the British side, and this is their analysis based on the events that have happened. But so far we're seeing that there is essentially no consequences to Prigozhin other than he's been exiled to Belarus. But according to Lukashenko, he's not even located in Belarus. He's not in Belarus, which would indicate that he is still in Russia, or he is still in Ukraine, or that Lukashenko is simply lying. Either way, it doesn't seem that there is so much movement against Prigozhin. And considering Putin's nature, it's very weird that Prigozhin is still alive after doing such an uprising. So generally, this is a very confusing situation, and it doesn't really help for them to speculate like this. Then we have the Institute for the Study of War, and essentially they spent an update talking about and reporting on everything that I report, but with a delay of a day or two. So now they're talking about all of the Russian advances that have happened around Bakhmut, which I mentioned in an older video. As we see here, this happened 2 to 3 days ago, and I was reporting on it back then. Now they're reporting on it today. So they have a delay, which is why I usually don't use these sources, because they spent a lot of time to actually verify it, while I have my reliable sources who throughout the conflict have been very reliable, hardly ever make mistakes. They do sometimes make mistakes, but I trust them enough to report what they say, and so far they are all aligning together. What Kremlin, Syriac Maps and Deep State Map all have in common is that most of their updates, I would put it at a 99th percentile, they completely agree with. The dates of the updates are usually not combined. For example, we have the latest update here by Deep State Map showing here west of Klishchiivka, the Ukrainians advanced. And if we take a look at when I updated it, which was on the 4th and here on the 7th of July, we see it here being on the 8th of July. So it is this one from the 7th on the 8th. So essentially they are updating this late when it comes to when I updated it. So this is the reason why I use Syriac maps in this report. If Deep State Map updated it first, which they sometimes do in comparison to Syriac maps, then I use their updates. So it's not because I prefer one over the other. It is simply because I report on the first one of my reliable sources that report on it. The difference between them and Remulent is that Remulent usually does not post a map update, which I can use as a reference. He usually speaks in a cryptic manner to not endanger operational secrecy for the Russian forces, since he is pro-Russian, he supports the Russian forces. Therefore, I have to estimate based on his words, and sometimes he doesn't even mention any of these differences in the territorial gains, as he does not have the details, since he has connections within Wagner, not the Russian forces themselves. Although he does have some there, it is not as close as his relation to the Wagner forces. So what I'm saying here is that I try to be as factual as I can by using the reliable sources that I have seen throughout the war. These are the 3 sources that I can trust. The rest of them have a very clear bias that manipulates their honesty when it comes to reporting. Most other sources do not report factually as much as these 3 sources, and that is what I have determined throughout almost a year of reporting on the war. Then we finally have this very interesting piece of news from the Institute of Study of War, and that is this claim right here, where they claim that elements of the 83rd Guards Air Assault VDV Brigade are complaining about a lack of rotations and expressing low morale after being recently committed to Bakhmut's southern flank. This is according to the Russian State Duma deputy of the Republic of Sakha, Sardana, sent a written appeal to Shoigu on July 8th regarding the complaints she received from families of the servicemen serving in the 83rd Guards VDV Brigade. She asked Shoigu to provide information on the provision of holidays and on rotation procedures, and asks Shoigu to initiate an inspection into the command of the 83rd Guards VDV Brigade. Her appeal likely indicates the elements of the 83rd Guards VDV Brigade, who are currently fighting and losing ground near Klishchiivka, have expressed concerns over the lack of personnel rotations to their families. The lack of rotations likely support their other indicators that Russian forces lack operational reserves. The unit's complaint about holidays also indicates low morale, as these forces appear to be less concerned with repelling ongoing Ukrainian counterattacks than about returning home. So we always continuously hear these reports of the Russians have low morale, they have no reserves, and now we actually get an insight into what they base this off. They say there is this written appeal to Shoigu where she specifically asks to provide information on the provision of holidays and on rotation procedures. So this is very interesting because I watched an interview about a Russian soldier who was mobilized in the partial mobilization. He essentially says that he was on a 4-month rotation, and during that time he essentially at the start he didn't get his payment. There was a lot of issues with the paperwork and all of that stuff. But then later on, at a delay, he received everything he was promised. So this could be something similar to that, where the soldiers fighting on the front line are having delays in the bureaucracy in relation to holidays and so on. All of this about rotation. There could also be some issues somewhere in the bureaucracy. The biggest issue so far in the war has proven to be bureaucracy, because a lot of military men want to do stuff, but then they aren't able to because there's so much paperwork that they had to do. Early on in the war, this has changed since then, but early on in the war there was a personal account by a Russian officer where he essentially said that he had control and command over a unit. He woke up at 5 a.m. He spent the whole morning until 9 a.m. writing reports and papers. He then has to go on a rotation. He has to go and report to his superiors. Then at the end of the day, when he's finally back home and ready to end the day, he then has to listen to reports of the soldiers he's in command of and then go to sleep. So essentially, he sees nothing of the combat, he sees nothing of the situation of the soldiers he's commanding. Now it has changed drastically. They have limited the amount of reports that the on-field officers have to do. They are sending it further down the bureaucratic lane and so on. So they're trying to effectivize it, prevent the soldiers actually fighting on the front line from having too much paperwork so that they can actually spend their time fighting. But this also brings in delays in the bureaucratic process, which means that their other issues arise, and this is only a part of the 83rd Guards VDV Brigade. So most likely this is probably an officer who either says that they have to keep fighting, or that they were lost somewhere in the bureaucratic process and they were forgotten, or somewhere in those lines. So it seems more like a mistake, either human or something of that regards, rather than an actual issue that is widespread in the army. So when they claim that the whole army has low morale and a lack of operational reserves due to the fact that part of the 83rd Guards VDV Brigade is not on rotation and does not have their vacation, it is one hell of a stretch, in my personal opinion. Something else to report on is the return of 5 Azov officers and defenders of Azovstal who were in an exchange last year between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. They were sent to Turkey in a part of a prisoner exchange between the two sides, and part of the agreement was that these 5 commanders would stay in Turkey and wouldn't return to Ukraine until the war was finished. However, breaking this agreement, Turkey and Ukraine have agreed to send these back to Ukraine, and they are now in Ukraine, not in Turkey. So this is most likely going to put further strain on the relations between Russia and Ukraine, as well as Russia and Turkey, since Turkey has been the mediator between Ukraine and Russia throughout all of these agreements, like this prisoner exchange deal, as well as the grain deal. Now that the mediator has now, quote-unquote, chosen a side by preferring Ukraine over Russia within this deal and breaking the deal it had with Russia, this could put further strain on future deals and possibly on the grain deal, which is currently having some issues with a prolonging of it, since the Russians say they see no point in prolonging it due to no necessary issues or emergency issues with the grain export through to the poorest countries. So it seems that there are some developments through this as well. Finally, on the front line itself, we see a few developments here as well, as the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks across the front line, doing some of more probing attacks, as well as a few armored assaults that are very limited in scale. However, there is an indication that we may see a stronger push soon. One of those indications is the continuous buildup of Ukrainian troops by the front line, especially in Zaporizhia, but also in Bakhmut. In combination with this, there was actually a missile strike against Kerch bridge. According to the news and evidence so far, the missile strike was actually shot down by the Russian forces and it did not hit the bridge. But there was indeed a missile strike against the bridge. This means that the Ukrainian forces are continuing their attempts at limiting the supply throughout the southern front, which could indicate that they still have their main force ready to use and that they're planning on using it. The second piece of evidence is that Tuesday on the 11th of July, the Vilnius NATO summit will happen. It is located in Lithuania. This will happen on Tuesday and Wednesday, the 11th and 12th of July. And in there, the NATO countries will discuss a lot of things. Part of those things that they're going to be discussing are the Ukraine's potential membership after the war, as well as further weapons supply to Ukraine. So the Ukrainians have an interest in showing one of two things before that summit. The first one would be their success, which would indicate that as long as the West continues sending and supplying weapons to Ukraine, they'll be able to recapture all of the territory that the Russians are currently holding. And the second thing would be, even losing an offensive would show them that would show the West that the amount of weapons and the amount of equipment the Ukrainians have received so far is not enough for Ukraine to get a favorable outcome of this war. So either way, to show these things to the West, they need to actually launch an offensive. If it goes well, if it goes wrong, they have some way to explain it. But not fighting at all would essentially be running away from the issue. So the Ukrainians have an interest in launching an offensive. However, the risks coupled with launching an offensive, especially since they do not have air superiority, are very high. This is why we're seeing the Ukrainians hesitate a lot when it comes to this, because logically speaking, it would make no sense to actually launch an offensive if you expect to fail it. But then again, we may see them launch it anyways in hopes that it may succeed and that they will get a favorable outcome. But essentially, this would most likely be some sort of spearhead attack where they gather a lot of forces. We have actually seen videos of the Challenger tanks arriving in the Zaporizhia front. So there could be an indication there that the spearhead is being formed here in the southern front. But we'll have to see what happens in the next coming days. And that is essentially all that has happened. There is this final piece of news. This is from a CNN article where the Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar from Ukraine has essentially admitted that the Crimean bridge attack last October, was due to the Ukrainian planning. She essentially listed 12 Ukrainian achievements since the start of the war on the 500th anniversary day, which is today. And then she says that of those 12 things, one of them, 273 days ago, we, quote unquote, launched the first strike on the Crimean bridge to disrupt Russian logistics. So here she is essentially admitting that the Ukrainians were the ones who attacked this bridge. So there are multiple pieces of evidence to suggest that the Ukrainians are the ones who actually launched this attack. And so far, the Russians have, quote unquote, not responded to this attack, since the Ukrainians did not take official responsibility for it. So they had an excuse not to, but now they do not. So the Russians would essentially be showing weakness by, quote unquote, not responding to it. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.